When the first snowstorm hit, the settlers in their hastily built cabins felt the chill creep in before the winds even began to howl. But the Amish settlers, with their humble, weathered homes, stood warm in their fortresses of faith, ingenuity, and preparation. Their secret? They built for the worst. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of resilience and faith in the face of adversity speak to your heart, join us tomorrow for another tale of frontier survival. The first blizzard of the season came early. By the time the clock struck midnight on November 15th, the wind was already howling across the open prairies. The plains had been eerily quiet for weeks, with only the occasional gust of wind rustling the dried grass. But now, a storm like no one had seen in years was sweeping in. For the Amish settlers, the coming of winter was a time of preparation. They had known, with the quiet certainty that only comes from years of experience, that the harshness of the plains demanded respect. They had prepared their homes long before the first snowflake fell. John Zook, a man whose reputation for meticulous planning preceded him, had spent the last month reinforcing the walls of his cabin. His neighbors in the nearby town of Lancaster had laughed when they saw him hauling stone after stone from the creek. They called him a fool for worrying about the coming cold. After all, they had built their homes quickly, finishing their cabins in mere days, with gaps between the logs big enough to let a draft whistle through. But John wasn't in a hurry. He had learned from his father that the worst winter was always the one you didn't expect. And while the town laughed at him for preparing a sturdy, double-walled cabin with thick insulation made from sawdust and clay, he knew that when the blizzards came, they wouldn't be laughing anymore. As the storm picked up speed, John gathered his children and led them inside. His wife, Sarah, had already prepared a simple meal of bread and potatoes, and they huddled together in front of the large stone fireplace that had been built carefully from the rocks in the surrounding hills. The flames danced in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room, and for a moment the cold outside felt like nothing more than a distant memory. Outside, the other settlers in Lancaster fought to keep the cold from overtaking their homes. The wind howled through the cracks in their hastily constructed cabins, and the snow piled high against their doors. The firewood they had hurriedly gathered in the fall was running low, and their thin walls offered little protection against the sub-zero temperatures. But for the Zooks, there was no panic. John smiled at his children as they played near the fire, the warmth of the cabin cocooning them from the harsh world outside. He knew that their survival wasn't just about strength, it was about foresight, faith, and preparation. He looked out the Promenade 279 window where the storm raged against the earth, but inside there was peace. Days passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. The once pristine plains were now buried under several feet of snow. The wind shrieked louder, and the temperature dropped further, but inside the Zook home, they were warm. The double-thick walls had held strong, and the fire in the hearth never wavered. Word had begun to spread among the townspeople. People from nearby farms started to show up at the Zook cabin, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They had been stuck in their homes for days, their fires barely keeping the cold at bay. Their children were shivering, and the supplies they had hurriedly stockpiled in the fall were running dangerously low. John welcomed them all inside. It wasn't just the warmth that he offered, but his calm assurance. "There's enough for all of us," he said quietly, ushering the tired families into the cabin. At first, there was hesitation. The townfolk had always looked down on the Amish for their old ways. They had mocked their simple lives, their refusal to build like the rest of them, always rushing to modernize. Now, in the face of the storm, it seemed those old ways had become the lifeline. Sarah set to work preparing a meal for their unexpected guests, her hands moving efficiently through the pantry that she had spent months stockpiling. The Zooks had learned early that survival in the harsh winter meant being self-sufficient. Their food, their firewood, their shelter, all of it had been thought through and carefully planned for. Outside, the other cabins were struggling. Some had already been abandoned, their inhabitants having fled to the town, hoping for refuge. But there was no refuge to be found in the cold, for the storm had shut down every route in and out of the town. No trains could come, no supplies could get through. The only shelter to be found was here, in John Zook's cabin. "Your house is like a fortress? One of the men from town said to John, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought you were crazy for building it like this." John smiled, though his eyes remained somber. "Crazy, maybe. But in the end, it's the ones who take the time to build right who survive." The storm raged on for days, and soon the Zook cabin was filled to the brim with neighbors seeking shelter. The little cabin, which had once seemed too large for just John's family, now felt warm and full of life. The other settlers began to see what they had missed. They had been in a hurry to survive the winter, but John had taken the time to build for the worst. And now, as the blizzards howled and their own homes failed them, they knew they had underestimated the Amish settlers and their quiet resilience. By the time the storm passed, the damage was done. The blizzards had left a deadly stillness in their wake, and the prairie was unrecognizable beneath a blanket of snow. It was late January now, and the storm had grown into a legacy, one that would be whispered about in Lancaster for years to come. The Zook cabin, which had become the haven for dozens of settlers over the past several weeks, stood firm as ever. Inside, the fire continued to crackle in the hearth, and the walls, thick with insulation, kept the bitter cold at bay. But for the others, the damage had already been done. Thomas Hargrave, a widowed farmer who had been among the first to take shelter at the Zook cabin, stood in the doorway of the now crowded living room, staring out at the frozen landscape. His cabin had failed him. The roof had caved in under the weight of the snow, and the single-wall structure, hastily built in the fall, had allowed the cold to seep in, leaving his family at the mercy of the elements. "Think it'll melt soon?" Thomas asked, his voice weary from the weeks of constant snow and cold. John Zook, who had become the unspoken leader of the group, stepped to the window and peered out at the endless white. He could feel the weight of the town's expectations on his shoulders. They had come to him for help, for refuge, but he couldn't provide everything. He wasn't a miracle worker. His cabin had withstood the storm, yes, but it hadn't been easy. He had prepared for years, but even he had to admit that the storm was unlike anything he had ever seen. "It'll take time," John said softly, his voice calm, steady. "Time for the snow to settle, and time for the railroads to get through. We've all got to hold on until then." But it wasn't just the snow that was the problem. It was the sickness that had begun to spread through the cabin. The cold had taken its toll on the children first, their small bodies unable to stay warm in the damp, airless cabins. A cough here, a fever there, it was all too familiar. They were in survival mode, but survival was a fragile thing. Sarah Zook had been the one to take the lead in tending to the sick. She moved from one child to the next, whispering soft words of comfort, while administering herbs and warm broths. But as the days dragged on, it became clear that their supplies, which had seemed so ample in the fall, were running low. The pantry that had once seemed overflowing now appeared sparse. Even the firewood, carefully stockpiled, was being used at a rate faster than they could keep up with. One cold evening, as Sarah worked by the light of a single candle, she looked up and caught John's eye. Her expression was a mixture of concern and quiet resolve. She knew as well as he did that they were running out of time. The other families, though grateful for their warmth, had started to grow anxious. The storm had taken a toll on their bodies, but it was their minds that would be their undoing. When hope fades, survival becomes that much harder. "John," Sarah said, her voice just above a whisper, "we can't keep this up for much longer." John nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking, and it was one thing to prepare for the cold, but another entirely to prepare for the emotional strain of a storm that would not end. He turned his gaze back to the fire, watching the way the flames flickered. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, the quiet certainty that hard work, faith, and humility would see them through. But now, as he watched his neighbors huddled in his home, the pressure weighed heavily on his chest. He knew what he had to do. It wouldn't be easy. It never was. But for the sake of his family, and for the sake of the others who had come to depend on him, he would keep building, keep preparing, keep holding on. The next week brought more snow, but it also brought new faces. Settlers from nearby towns, their homes just as ill-prepared as the ones in Lancaster, had heard about the Zook cabin and its sturdy walls. They had made their way through the treacherous snow, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs and the desperate hope that they would find warmth and safety. The Zooks, though weary, welcomed them in. There was no hesitation, no reluctance. This was what they had been preparing for. Not just survival, but the survival of those who could not survive on their own. It wasn't just the Amish who had to survive, it was everyone. "Welcome, friends," John said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had become a fixture of the cabin's atmosphere. He stepped aside to let the newcomers in, each of them bundled against the cold, their faces flushed from the wind. "Thank you," one of the women said, her voice hoarse. "We thought we were lost." Sarah Zook stepped forward, offering a bowl of warm broth. The woman accepted it gratefully, taking a deep, shuddering breath as she warmed her hands by the fire. Her husband, a man whose face John recognized from the town, sank heavily into a chair, his eyes downcast. "We've lost so much," he muttered. "Cattle, food stores, our cabins, gone." John nodded, understanding the depth of the man's despair. It was hard to watch everything you had worked for crumble in the face of nature's fury. But the Zooks had been through their own share of loss and hardship. It was what made them strong. "We're all in this together now," John said quietly. "No one is alone here." The words were simple, but they carried weight. In this place, surrounded by the thick walls and the warmth of the fire, there was a sense of community that none of the townfolk had truly understood. They had thought the Amish were foolish for their old-fashioned ways, but now, in the midst of the storm, it was clear who had built with foresight and care. As the night wore on, more families came. Some brought nothing but the clothes on their backs, others came with what little they had salvaged from their homes. All of them shared the same tired, hollow look in their eyes, the look of people who had faced the unrelenting power of the elements, and come to realize that their survival had never been guaranteed. And yet, inside John Zook's cabin, the warmth never faded. The fire crackled. The children played quietly in the corner, their faces flushed with warmth. The adults gathered in quiet conversation, grateful for the shelter that had, against all odds, kept them safe. "We will survive this," John said softly, almost to himself. The storm was still raging outside, but within these walls there was something more enduring than the cold. There was a bond, a shared strength, that no blizzard could ever break. Spring arrived slowly, as it always did on the prairie. The snow that had once blanketed the land began to melt, retreating to reveal the earth beneath. It was a quiet thaw, the ground soaked in the remnants of a winter that had tested them all. The air was still sharp with the remnants of frost, but the faint promise of warmer days lingered in the breeze. Inside the Zook cabin, life had settled into a quiet rhythm once more. The fire in the hearth still crackled in the evenings, though it was no longer the all-consuming warmth it had been during the storm. Sarah Zook hummed softly as she worked by the fire, her movements gentle as she prepared their evening meal. The children played in the corner, their laughter filling the space that had once been filled with tension and uncertainty. The town had begun to rebuild, its streets cleared, and its people emerging from their homes with newfound respect for what they had almost lost. Those who had sought refuge in the Zook cabin had returned to their land, each family more prepared than before. They had learned the hard way that survival required more than just speed and effort. It required careful thought, patience, and, above all, foresight. John Zook stood outside, the last remnants of winter clinging to the land. He gazed over the fields where the snow had once piled high, now revealing the hard, frozen earth beneath. He knew the land would come to life again in time, but for now it was enough to breathe in the crisp air and take in the quiet peace of the moment. The storm had passed, and the lessons of those long, cold months would stay with him and the others forever. They had learned that survival wasn't just about building strong walls, it was about building community, about looking out for one another. The Zooks had provided shelter, not just from the cold, but from despair. The cabin had been a sanctuary, and in that sanctuary, a bond had been forged between neighbors, something stronger than the wind or the snow. As John stood, looking at the land that had tested them so fiercely, he realized that while the cabin would eventually fade into memory, the spirit of survival of faith, resilience, and community would never be forgotten.